Thank you so much for having me. I'm actually currently sitting in Austin, Texas, although I'm about to be in DC in a couple of days for a move. So, but glad to be here. Glad to share my experiences over the past year with the Wisconsin Voter Protection Team. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now to show the presentation. So we should be good to go. All right, so just to start off with a little introduction, my name is Alexis Rangel, pronouns are she and they. My current position is I am policy counsel at the National Center for Transgender Equality, but I'm here to speak on this topic because last year, for 2020, I was the Deputy Voter Protection Director for the Wisconsin Coordinated Campaign for the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. I'm particularly excited to be here speaking with you because I'm a Rambler, an alum of the law school and the graduate school where I got my Juris Doctor and Master of Public Policy. And I also studied at Sam Houston State University where I was a Bearcat. And to start off with some background of how I got into the role as Deputy Voter Protection Director, while I was in school in Chicago and in the few years after I graduated, working in and around Chicago, I put a lot of time and energy as a volunteer and as a staffer on various electoral campaigns, including working in the Democratic primaries for a national campaign, working for Elizabeth Warren, and then on various local and state races, judicial campaigns and state rep races, things of that nature, building up my experience for what those campaigns needed and setting me up for success with the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Also, as a volunteer, well, not a volunteer, as a poll worker in Illinois, in Chicago, throughout law school and afterwards, working for the Chicago Board of Elections on election day, running the precinct where I lived in Albany Park and in different precincts around the city as well, which set me up with the right knowledge base of what to expect for working in voter protection in Wisconsin. So I want to start with a little bit of a baseline about what voter protection programs have historically been. It's sort of a niche program that folks aren't really familiar with, in my experience, with the exception of large election years. And so while smaller campaigns can run voter protection programs that are more local and very targeted to the districts they're running in, large statewide or national voter protection programs have a very distinct setup. First and foremost, they tended to have been small teams of 3 to 4 attorneys, sometimes smaller for smaller states, and always started late in the cycle for the November elections, tending to stick towards large statewide elections or national elections. And for elections in November, for example, these teams wouldn't even begin to be formulated until August. So with just a few short, quick months to get programs set up, to do things like run voter protection hotlines for voters to call in and have their questions answered, to set up poll observing programs, to send volunteers to in-person voting locations to monitor what was going on, and to prepare for any sort of urgent litigation that might happen. Historically, these teams have always been staffed by folks with law degrees, attorneys, and these folks have always managed teams of volunteer attorneys and law students in getting these programs set up. Apologies. Yeah, so these programs have always been small, very quick to be set up before the election, and have been very, very heavily focused on the legal side of things. with litigation and monitoring what's going on with state and local election law and regulations. And Wisconsin is a very specific and nuanced place for elections. I imagine that most of the folks who are here and going to be watching this video are going to be associated with Loyola and maybe have some familiarity with Illinois election systems. And while there are some similarities, Wisconsin has some very, very important distinctions. First of which is that in Illinois, elections are administered primarily at the county level, with the exception of Chicago, who has their own board of elections as outlined in Illinois state law. In Wisconsin, however, elections are administered on the municipal level, which is something that many Wisconsinites are very proud of and gives a fair degree of local control to elections, which a lot of people view as a very good thing. There are over 1,800 election authorities in Wisconsin, making the job of voter protection teams that much more difficult, because instead of interacting with just the counties, you have to interact with all of these municipalities and build those relationships. So it complicates things by several orders of magnitude. Another distinction with Wisconsin specifically is that absentee ballots cannot be counted before election day. So many states allow absentee ballots to be submitted and counted to minimize the work on election day. But in Wisconsin, they have to be collected, stored, and then opened and counted and tabulated on election day themselves. Now, these municipal election authorities also have the ability to decide what format or structure they want to count these ballots. For the vast majority of municipalities in Wisconsin, these ballots are stored and counted at the election site that the voter would normally go to vote in person. So at your regular polling location, that is the location where the absentee ballot that you submit will be counted. Several cities have the option, or every city has the option to opt into a program called Central Count, where the municipality counts all of their ballots, not at the polling location, but at a central location. And in a site, say like Milwaukee or Madison, this is something that allows for a lot of efficiency, but it changes the rules for how voters can interact, because absentee ballots on election day cannot be delivered to the polling location that you would normally go to vote. They have to be delivered to the central count location. And so that changes the advice that voter protection teams and programs give to voters as they're going around, and just makes things very, very interesting, because so much changes, not just between counties, but between different municipalities within the county. So there's a lot of coordination that goes into making sure that every voter has the information that's specific to their specific municipality and where they are. So to set the stage for 2020, we have to talk about Stacey Abrams and the Georgia elections that laid the foundation for her program on the Democratic side, on the progressive side, pushing for voter protection programs, and that's Fair Fight. So after Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial run and the results of that election, she devoted herself to building up this organization called Fair Fight, which was primarily focused on building up voter protection programs around the country and building up funding for such programs. The atmosphere for how these programs were going to be, voter protection programs were going to be defined, and how they were going to be expanded in scope and with resources, was set in motion by Stacey Abrams and the Fair Fight program. In Wisconsin, the way that this played out is that funding was made available to the Democratic Party of Wisconsin to begin building their program more than 6 months before it had historically started. So our voter protection director that I served under, David Kronig, was hired at the beginning of 2020, whereas historically would have been hired in August to start laying the foundations for what the program in Wisconsin would look like, and to build up the voter protection strategies that we were going to need. But even with this preparation, 2020 was a year of change, and things started happening that shifted our entire cultural landscape and impacted elections all over the country, but had very specific impacts for Wisconsin as well. The April election in Wisconsin was a presidential primary, statewide presidential primary, and disaster is the only way that we can describe that election. Starting with the governor attempting to postpone the election just days before the election was set to take place. The Supreme Court of Wisconsin responding fairly quickly in a lawsuit to order that the election proceed as initially scheduled in April, and even with the Supreme Court of the United States issuing a ruling changing that same week, changing when absentee ballots for that April election had to be postmarked by. So this was a month of incredible change in Wisconsin elections and incredible instability. In the context of the pandemic, another issue that cropped up nationwide but hit Wisconsin particularly hard was that poll workers were afraid to show up because of concerns around the pandemic. This means thousands of poll workers around the state did not show up, and many polling places had to close. In Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee alone, they went from 180 polling locations to just 5, which created hours-long waits and many photos like this. Many photos like this and situations with folks waiting, and many ultimately deciding that it wasn't worth it and opting out of voting altogether. In the context of the pandemic as well, as we saw nationwide, absentee voting in the April election skyrocketed to more than 70% of ballots cast in the April election. And historically, that number has been a tenth of that. So that was a huge change that election authorities were not prepared to deal with, which caused the counting of the votes to extend far longer than they anticipated. And there were days, it was days before the results of this April election was announced. So in response to everything that happened with this April disaster, the voter protection program for the Wisconsin Democrats identified several areas of opportunity to begin to address in building the program that we needed to happen for the November election. First and foremost, we needed to identify health and safety protections, not just for voters, but for poll workers and for our poll observers that were going to be going to these places as well. This came up in a lot of different ways, in the ways that you might anticipate, that centered on cleaning and sanitizing items and creating protocols to make sure that folks were limiting the things that they touched as they came through the voting process, but also looking at different opportunities of shifting what was available so that folks could vote more safely, increasing the number of absentee voting sites during early vote, increasing the size of sites and going after and pursuing sports arenas or convention centers so that there was more air and space instead of being in a crowded library or in a small school gymnasium, things of that nature. The next area of opportunity was an intense information campaign. Because of the pandemic, folks were looking for alternate ways to register that they hadn't been able to register to vote before. The rules shifted. absentee ballots became hugely important with folks needing to know how to request their absentee ballots, how to fill it out, what the rules were to be able to send it back to make sure that it was counted, and then all of the local rules that were associated with ballot collection, including things like absentee ballot drop boxes that municipalities had the option of setting up, but were not required to, or other various programs that would make voting easier, like curbside voting or drive-through voting. These were things that we wanted to work with election authorities to imagine how they could be executed, to encourage them to create these programs, and then to support them and to make sure that voters knew that these programs were available. Also, something that had never been addressed by a voter protection program before, but was clear needed to be addressed in order to have a successful election, was that we needed to make sure that there were poll workers throughout the state showing up. Historically, folks who work the polls tend to be older. They tend to be folks who are very dedicated to their communities, but have health issues or limited mobility, things that put them at risk for COVID, which is why we saw so many poll workers just not show up in the April election. So a big focus of our program was to make sure that we were recruiting poll workers and sending them to each municipality to make sure that their training programs were filled, that they would be fully able to safely staff all of their polling locations. This was further complicated by the local rules in that every municipality had their own training program for poll workers, whether it was online or in person was completely up to the municipality as well. They had their own timelines. And so as we were recruiting folks and making sure they had the right information, we had to keep track of all of the different rules across Wisconsin municipalities to make sure that folks had the right information. Because specifically, Wisconsin requires that poll workers live in the municipality that they work in. So someone in Racine or in Kenosha couldn't drive to Milwaukee to help make sure Milwaukee had enough poll workers. We had to recruit from within those communities themselves and make sure they had all the right information. And our last area of opportunity that we identified was expanding our poll observing program. Because of our goal of making sure that there were additional sites available, not just for election day, but in early vote as well, we had to make sure that these places were staffed, that these health and safety protocols that we were pushing for and working on were being not just set down, but followed and implemented, and that folks, when they showed up to vote, would have all of the information that they needed and have support and poll observers to ask questions for, to make sure that they were given every opportunity to stay safe and to securely cast a ballot. So moving forward with those areas of opportunity, we had three distinct sections of time that we were working in. The first was focusing on absentee voting and working with municipalities, pushing for municipalities to install drop boxes across their municipality in places particularly that were well represented and not focused on any one particular aspect or section of the community, but evenly distributed and accessible. And making sure that folks had all the right information. To do that, we worked within our campaign mechanism, making sure that we trained our organizers to have all of the right information as they were doing voter outreach. But we also partnered with a number of organizations, both inside of Wisconsin and outside of Wisconsin, who were doing direct voter contact to make sure that voters knew all of the deadlines that they needed to know, that they had more than enough time to request and receive their ballot and to return it in a way that made sense for them, whether it was by mailing it back with enough time for it to be delivered by election day, or dropping it off in these municipal drop boxes that we were pushing for, or being collected by the municipality themselves. In working on this particular issue as well, we partnered with, or not partnered with, but we supported a number of innovative municipal programs and made sure that voters knew about them. One that caused a lot of news was in Madison called Democracy in the Parks. And this was a program created by the election authority in Madison to have staffers present in municipal parks around the city for 2 specific weekends for folks to be able to come in and return their ballot to an election staffer and to hand it in rather than putting it in a drop box. The municipal government viewed this as a live in-person drop box, or as the clerk's staff, no different from a voter coming into the clerk's office and handing their ballot to the clerk's staff. This was not seen as something that was so innocent by a number of parties, and resulted in a lawsuit against the city that was eventually shot down. But that was a very innovative program, and I for one would love to be able to turn in my ballot at a city park at any point in my life. That just sounds like a good time to me. The next period of time that we worked in was the in-person absentee voting, which started on October 20th through November 1st. In pushing for more sites and health and safety protocols, we really needed to make sure that we had a poll observing program for this. And this is something that was completely innovative, the first time that we had done anything like this through the Democratic Party of Wisconsin, a statewide early voting program operating all 20 of those days, all 14 of those days. I was looking at October 20th. Operating day in and day out, every day, a poll observing program from October 20th through November 1st, and supplementing the work that we were doing on election day. Now, thankfully, we had a large enough staff in the voter protection team to be able to support this, because what this required is an election day operation every day, day in and day out, taking our staff in shifts and focusing primarily on what was happening that day. Early voting started off very shaky with a lot of confusion, a lot of issues happening, especially those first couple days, and then died off. So it was a very intense program that we were very, very proud of and found a lot of success in. Can't speak highly enough about all of the good work that our team was able to accomplish with this early vote program. And then last but not least, our election day program, which has been traditionally manning the poll observing program. Now, this was a day that we all spent a 14-hour day in Zoom, in one particular Zoom meeting all day. This is our leadership, our statewide boiler room. If you're not familiar with that phrase, it's a fairly common campaign phrase, just meaning a group of leadership that usually historically has been camped out together in some sort of conference room or at someone's house, answering phones and getting people the information that they need and solving issues that are happening around the state. Our poll observing program was the largest, on election day, was the largest program in the history of Wisconsin, and didn't allow us to have just the leadership team that you see here. We actually had 5 regional teams with more than 70 attorneys across the state, solving issues locally and raising issues to our statewide team whenever they came to that. Solved issues throughout the day, and once voting ended, the work didn't stop. For these central count locations, they were required to continue counting ballots until they were finished. And in particular in Milwaukee, we were prepared to have our poll observers in place and our leadership team responding to issues until they were finished counting, which we were assured would be by the time the sun came up. Thankfully, it did not last that long, and we were able to get the results from the city of Milwaukee as they were announced by the Milwaukee County Clerk at around, I believe it was 3 or 4 in the morning, and I was finally able to get some sleep after that, and able to take a breath and to rest and brace myself for what was coming next. So after getting the results at 4 o'clock and sending them to our leadership team and our voter protection team to make sure everybody had the right information, we were able to take a break and go to sleep and be up for an 8 o'clock check-in meeting the next morning to make sure that everything had settled in a way that we were comfortable with and to prep for anything. I very distinctly remember that meeting that morning. We were very celebratory, even though results hadn't been announced yet. We had completed a program that we were incredibly proud of, and we were ready to take a breather. And we celebrated, and our boss said, "Good job. Take a rest. We'll get together tomorrow for next steps." 20 minutes after we ended that call, we got an emergency text asking us to jump on another call to talk about what was going to be coming next. Because of the contention of the election, we wanted to make sure that the certification process of all of these of all of the results was monitored to the best of our ability. And the way that certification processes work in Wisconsin is that the county certifies the results of each of the municipalities that reside in it, and then the state has a statewide certification process that it goes through. And that occurred over the following 2 weeks. We did our best to get volunteers to show up at these what are called county canvasses, at these certification events, to make sure that things were happening smoothly and to monitor what was going on. And then, of course, to brace for the possibility of a recount, which was fairly anticipated, although it didn't take the form that we were expecting. So while when the results were announced that Biden had won the Wisconsin election, Wisconsin law stipulated that the loser of the election could option for a recount in the counties that they wanted, or in specific county or in statewide. We waited to see what would happen, and in the end, the Trump campaign decided to pursue recounts in just 2 counties, in Dane County, where Madison is, and in Milwaukee County. And as part of that, the voter protection team was asked to engage with both of these events, which happened in convention centers, were live streamed, and had hundreds of folks showing up and being present, working and volunteering for these events. It was one of the, no, I can say that with absolute, it was absolutely the most interesting election experience that I've ever had walking into the Milwaukee recount. Because election authorities are designated on the municipal level, the way the recount operated was that there were tables and sections set out throughout this very large room, with each municipality coming in and enacting the services that they needed to recertify the results that they had initially announced, and working through a schedule to make sure that everything was done methodically and on time. So Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee took up about half the room and was present for the entirety of the recount, with each smaller municipality coming in in rotating sections and taking up their time. There were hundreds of observers from the Democratic Party and from the Republican Party who showed up to coordinate and to sit in front of these tables as the municipal workers went through and counted on each side and double checked everything that was going on. There were plenty of contentious interactions, particularly at the start of the recount. It was widely publicized that and reported that not a single ballot was counted at the first day of the Milwaukee County recount because there were heated debates and arguments about the process that would happen, including not just the process of counting, but the health and safety protocols. You see the yellow lines on the floor, which was the requirement that observers would stay behind those lines. You see multiple chairs, one chair for each of the major parties, and then a third chair for any alternate parties that would show up. There was disagreements on enforcement of how to properly wear a mask or how to interact with the municipal workers or the attorneys for each of the campaigns that were up at the front of the room. And it was a very, very wild experience. Thankfully, going into that I ended up being in a taking up a very niche role that suited my experience very well. We had our team of attorneys up at the front of the room interacting with the board. And then we had all of our volunteers out on the floor and our organizers that were helping to organize. And our voter protection team had the special role of being the liaison between the legal arguments and decisions that were happening up at the front of the room and connecting with each of the observers and making sure they knew what their obligations were, they knew what our purpose for being there was, and how to go around and operate. We took a strategy that our role was to diffuse tension as much as possible. Our goal was to help this process go through as quickly and as efficiently as possible, while giving the Trump campaign and Republicans the opportunities that they needed to challenge anything that was less than desirable, or anything that should be rightly challenged, because municipal workers, particularly election workers in 2020, were doing it because they loved it. They worked long hours and they were, in our mind, doing their best, but mistakes happen. And so we wanted to be sure to give observers every chance they had to catch mistakes and to make sure that the results were as they should be. All of this none of this to say that we didn't also have a good time and enjoy ourselves. This was a time that the campaign was very, very cloistered and separated away, most of us in isolation with a quarantine throughout the entire campaign. And this was our first opportunity to be working face to face with our teammates and with our incredible volunteers. And so throughout that recount process, we took opportunities to connect, not only with our volunteers, but within the team, with things like Turtleneck Tuesdays that we invited the Republicans to participate in with us. And on some occasions they actually did. And really made the most of the in-person time that we had together as we were working. We also had some pretty interesting controversies, my favorite of which was the wristband controversy. So in order to get into the recount, you had to sign in, and the convention center issued everyone who signed in a wristband. This changed from day to day, and towards the end of the recount, the convention center issued folks emoji wristbands that had this particular emoji on it, which upset some people. And the tension got to a point where reporters were actually asking our Milwaukee County clerk to respond and why this had been done, and his response was incredible in that he thought it was ice cream. So that very much lightened the mood, and I have my wristband framed, and it's something that I will treasure forever. So after the recount ended, reaffirming the results of the election and actually resulting in a wider margin, win margin, than had been initially reported. The results were challenged again in various forms and lawsuits, both within Wisconsin and famously, maybe notoriously, with the state of Texas filing a federal lawsuit to challenge multiple states, including Wisconsin. In the end, the Supreme Court affirmed the results, both the Supreme Court of Wisconsin and the Supreme Court of the United States, and our Wisconsin electors cast their electoral college votes, which is where the campaign ended for me. Important to note, however, that though this is where the campaign ended for me, these points of contention continued with legislative hearings run by the Wisconsin State Legislature and their assembly, looking into how the election was administered, hearings with the Wisconsin Election Commission, litigation that was brought. We even had a Supreme Court decision just last month affecting the rules for Wisconsin election law and how those are implemented. So this continued and still continues. And moving forward, there are going to be significant changes in voter protection programs in the future. Most significantly, there's a very strong push for these programs to be made permanent and not just be in response to certain elections. And very happy to know that that my boss, the director of voter protection, was asked to stay on and to manage a year-round permanent voter protection program in Wisconsin. We anticipate that more programs will become permanent throughout the country, particularly in states that are hotly contested. That's all I have for my stories. And at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions or to have a conversation about what voter protection looked like, or what questions anyone has about what voter protection might look like in the future.
Alexis, thank you so much. That was fascinating. That was fascinating. And of course, I do appreciate that you were able to, take a breath at some points before it all began again, and that there wasn't a complete absence of humor. The best, of course, being the ice cream emoji. Wow, if you're gonna get your emojis wrong, that's kind of a critical one. Questions from folks? You can go ahead and put it in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask questions.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Hi, Alexis. I had a couple of questions, and a couple of people know this, but I was originally from Wisconsin. So my first statement is, when I saw the emoji, I thought chocolate custard. I bet they do those for the Wisconsin State Fair every year. But again, it's a Wisconsin thing, I guess. My questions, I sort of had two. The first was, if you could talk a little bit more about what the rules are on absentee and mail-in ballots in Wisconsin. Because when I moved to Illinois and discovered how little I had to do to vote by mail, it was shocking in comparison to what Wisconsin requires. And I did think about that in this last election when, there were so many people who didn't want to go to the polls. So kind of how those types of rules have an impact on the voter suppression. And then a bigger, broader question, especially since now more organizations, like you mentioned, this organization is continuing in Wisconsin. When I think of voter suppression, I think of it as a lot of things that happen way before that August deadline when you've got people on the ground. I think about, purging the voter rolls. I think about the voter ID requirements and whether or not your signature matches and all the rest of that stuff that makes it more difficult for certain people to be able to vote. And all of that's going to happen before election day and people actually showing up. And so, kind of what are the directions you see these organizations going? What are some of the other areas besides that right before the election voter suppression issue?
Absolutely. So to answer your first question with regard to absentee ballots, absentee ballot rules in Wisconsin are very strict and have a lot of steps, a lot of steps and a lot of requirements. So current Wisconsin law has voter ID requirements that transfer generally into absentee ballot requests as well. And in order to request an absentee ballot, that requires folks to submit an ID from a very specific list of acceptable IDs in order to even request their absentee ballot. This is also a state where a state that requires folks to specify a reason for their absentee ballot request. Whether they're going to be out of town and having it mailed somewhere else, or whether it's they are unable to leave their home for some reason. And this particular rule caused a lot of contention in Wisconsin in 2020 because of the pandemic. The Wisconsin Election Commission initially shared some information suggesting that folks, because of the pandemic, could state in their absentee ballot request that they were indefinitely confined, which has a very loose definition, saying that folks for a period of time can't leave their home or are unable to be present on election day or in-person early vote. And suggested that that voters could request an absentee ballot and as an indefinitely confined voter due to the pandemic. This caused a lot of contention and a lot of disagreement and some legal argument as well. But in the end, folks were able to request their ballots because Wisconsin does not require, nor should they require, folks to prove any sort of medical condition in order to request their absentee ballot. So that caused a lot of contention. There are also very specific rules about how to fill a ballot out. In Wisconsin, ballots have to be witnessed by someone who is not the voter. The voter has to be witnessed filling out their ballot, and there are rules about who can witness a ballot. This person has to be 18 years of age. They have to provide their address. They don't necessarily have to be a Wisconsin voter, but they have to provide that information. And what we saw in April was that a startlingly high number of ballots were rejected. I think the percentage was of overall ballots rejected was less than 1%. But the number of ballots was startlingly high, which is what pushed us in our program to focus on the information campaign and making sure that folks knew what these rules were and were able to distinguish. There were also rules for how these ballots, once they were received by the municipal clerks, how they were interpreted and what sort of information was actually required to be on the absentee ballot certification in order to be counted. And there were arguments back and forth over, well, they put, this witness put their city and their street, but they didn't put the zip code. So should we throw it out or should we not? Which I have an opinion on that. Many municipal clerks had opinions on that as well, and they had practices that they'd been doing for years with their elections in identifying voters who sent in their ballots so that they didn't have to be returned to the voter in order to be recompleted or corrected in some way. So yeah, lots of requirements that need I think need to be reconsidered, but certainly need or have impacts on voting and make it more difficult for folks to go through the process. with the move towards these long-term voter programs, I am very hopeful that part of these programs are going to be focused on targeting these rules that don't serve to allow voters, eligible voters, to be able to cast their ballots in a safe and secure and efficient way. And we've seen that in particular, another program that was extended and made a year-round permanent is the program here in Texas. And living in Austin, I'm keeping tabs on very closely at what's going on in the Austin legislature. And the voter protection director for the Texas Democrats has been testifying at committee hearings for the state legislature as these different voter requirement bills are being submitted, changing the rules, making sure that there is a strong voice pushing back for unnecessary restrictions and in favor of expanding the right to vote and making sure that folks are able to properly access this very fundamental right. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Do you have any follow-ups?
Not really. It really was the sort of, as we look forward, there are so many different things that states do that kind of have the impact of suppressing votes that we can't just correct by focusing on what happens in the month or so before an election. So how are we moving? And it looks like we have some impetus towards moving to fix more of those types of issues. I had one, since I have the floor, I'll ask it again. When you were saying that in Wisconsin, the elections are sort of like run or handled at the municipal level. Does that mean even the very small towns and villages? And I'm thinking about that and just thinking, what a mess. But did it extend all the way down to very small?
Even the very small towns with part-time city officials. There are a number of municipal clerks in Wisconsin that are part-time municipal clerks running these elections and working very minimal hours. And there have been some creative local solutions to help address that. Municipalities working closely with each other, particularly in contracts or in training, that nearby municipalities can collaborate to make things easier. But yeah, some very, very small towns in control of every aspect of their elections.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Christine, yep, I thought maybe you had a question there.
I have two questions. One, which is just a random question, which is actually following from what Annette just said. I was wondering what happened like on the Menominee Reservation. Is that considered a municipality? Are they chopped up in different municipalities? I just was wondering how they handle that.
I am not directly certain. So my portfolio with the Wisconsin Voter Protection Team was focused primarily on Southeast Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and the counties south of there. We did have a staffer who, on our voter protection team, whose region encompassed that and interacted directly with our organizers and the campaign apparatus that was interacting with those reservations and other reservations around the state. And I wouldn't be able to answer that question for specifically how they operate, but I know it was something that I had teammates that were focused on.
Yeah, I was just curious. But the question I wanted to ask is, looking forward and looking at the voter suppression legislation that's occurring different places. I know some of that is going to be, there'll be attempts at overturning that through the courts. But I'm just wondering what is happening about that and what's the strategy?
Well, I mean, in every state there are fantastic advocates who are pushing against these bills that are popping up that are suppressing the vote and pushing for strategies and priorities that are going to be expanding the franchise. And that includes